So before we start working on the base, let's talk just for a minute about some of the strategies we're going to use to be able to secure this stock so that we can work on it. Because remember, I'm not going to be using my workbench. And a lot of you out there may not yet have a workbench, and you're wondering the same thing. How am I going to do this without already having a workbench? So probably the most important thing in the shop that I'm going to be using is going to be a pair of saw benches. I may even bring in a higher pair of saw horses later if I need to. I'm going to see how my low saw benches work out. But definitely a pair of them, and I'm going to be using these for just about everything. I'll be boring out the mortises, boring and chopping on these. All my ripping and cross-cutting tasks are going to be done on these. So the great majority of the work is going to be done using the saw benches. So it's going to be real important for you to have saw benches or saw horses. If you don't already have saw benches, run out to Home Depot or Lowe's, get yourself some of those metal sawhorse brackets, a box of nails, and a couple of 2x4s, and knock yourself together a couple of sawhorses. Make them about hip height, maybe 30 inches or so, because you're going to use them for everything. That's really going to be your main stock securing tool, is your sawhorses. So get yourself a pair of sawhorses, and what you can do is actually put your boards on top of your sawhorses and make a quasi workbench out of that, and you can do a lot of work right on top of your boards for your top and your apron, or whatever your design is. Mostly the boards for your bench top. You can do a lot just on top of those boards using them as a workbench top. If you're going to do a laminated top, use the sawhorses to laminate your boards first. Once you have your entire top laminated, you basically have a workbench, and the base of the workbench is the sawhorses. You can use the top to do the work to build the base. So the saw benches or sawhorses are definitely going to be key players. A couple of F-clamps. These are definitely going to be helpful because, again, we don't have a vise yet, so we're going to need a way to secure stock to work on it. And a wooden hand screw clamp, at least one, is going to be very beneficial as well. So one of the easiest ways to work on the legs is just to stick them on a saw bench, or if you have a pair of saw horses that you can put the 2x12s for your top across, just straddle them and sit on it and hold it in place. And because these mortises are so big, they're 1 inch wide, I don't have a 1-inch mortise chisel, and it would take forever and really damage, take its toll on a 1-inch bench chisel. So I'm going to use a brace and bit to bore out most of the waste before I square it up with a chisel. And I'm actually going to use a number 14 bit. And this is a 7/8 inch diameter bit instead of a 1 inch. What this is going to do is give me a little bit of clearance on either side of the mortise, so that I've got some room for the bit to wander, because they do tend to wander, especially in grain in something like this Doug fir, where the late wood really tends to be very hard, and the early wood tends to be fairly soft. So the bit wants to wander, and the lead screw is just going to want to grab in the early wood, the softer early wood, so you may not be able to center the bit perfectly. So right now, my main goal when boring is I want to keep the bit vertical or plumb in this direction. As long as I stay far enough away from the end of the mortise, it's okay if I'm off a little bit in the direction away from me, towards and away from me, if I'm not perfectly plumb. I'm still going to try and get as plumb as I can. But if I'm not perfectly plumb, that's okay. But I do want to be as plumb as I can be in this side-to-side direction. So sitting in line with the mortise, in line with the bit, helps me to do that. Now, I know that this bit I need to turn 22 times in order to get down, 1.25 inches, and that's how deep I want my mortise. So I'm going to make 22 turns once the cutting lip starts engaging the wood. And in order for me to try and keep everything nice and straight, I'm going to rest my hand on my forehead, and I'm going to bore so that I can sight down the bit to try and keep things as plumb as possible. And this helps me keep it plumb in this direction, but it also helps me keep it plumb in this direction as well, because I'm sighting down that bit sort of like a rifle sight. So I can get it started, and as soon, okay, right there, the cutting lips start engaging. Now I can start counting, and I'm going to turn 22 times to get down 1.25 inches. Okay, now I'll bore 2 more holes. And then once I have the holes bored, I'll just use a couple of chisels. I'm using a 1-inch chisel and a 1.5-inch chisel to go ahead and clean up the inside of the mortise and square everything up. And again, you can just sit on the board and that'll hold it in place for you. I'll make the last cut down with the chisel right in that scribe line. I can take the 1-inch chisel and start chopping back towards the end of the mortise. So after finishing up the mortise, I went ahead and laid out the tenons. Like I said, I'm got about a 1.25-inch tenon on these aprons. I ripped the aprons from some 2x12 stock. The aprons ended up about 3.5, 3.75 inches wide. I just took my dividers and divided the 2x12 into 3 sections, and then ripped one long section off that 6-foot 2x12 and cross-cut 3 side stretchers. These ended up about 18 inches long with a shoulder-to-shoulder distance of about 15.5 inches and tenons of about 1.25 inches by 1 inch thick. And I laid out the tenons to fit the mortises, and then, as I mentioned, we're trying to build this without the use of a workbench. One of the easiest ways that I found for sawing the tenons is, again, using your saw bench. You just take a hand screw clamp. You can clamp your tenon stock, your stretcher, between the 2 screws of the hand screw clamp, and then use a couple of F clamps to clamp the hand screw clamp to the saw bench. And it's actually a very stable platform for sawing the cheek cuts of these tenons. And then again, just like we did with the porringer table, I'm going to take a chisel. I'm actually going to go in, clean up the bottom here, and give that shoulder a slight undercut so that it'll fit nice and tight. So once the side stretcher assembly is all dry fit, everything fits good, before I go draw boring and assembling this, the last thing I want to do to these legs is cut away this half lap in the front. I don't know if the camera is picking it up, but you can see how this is X'd out here and along the side about 1.25 inches, 1 3/8. We're going to cut this section away so that we can lay the big front aprons into that half lap. So disassemble this up, and again, I'll just clamp things to my saw bench and make a cross cut at the bottom and then rip it down. So what I've done here is just clamp a big stop block to the front of the saw bench, and I'm going to use it sort of as a big bench hook that I can then go ahead and saw this shoulder. Then we've got two choices to make the rip cut. We can go back to the hand screw clamp, or we can just straight up clamp the leg horizontal to the saw bench and rip like we normally would rough stock. Just make sure you check your plumb. Now, before we use this as a joinery surface, you'll probably want to clean it up with a chisel, maybe a file, just to smooth it out and make sure that this face here is square to the side of the leg. So I actually cut the shoulder here a little bit fat when I sawed it out, just so I could use my scribe line, my knife line, to chisel to make sure I get a nice flat shoulder and a good joint there. Maybe, a little bit overly cautious, but considering I'm working on the saw bench and not on a workbench, I felt it better to be a little bit cautious and saw a little fat of my line, and then just chop down to the line so I get a nice flat shoulder there. The other thing I'm doing is continually checking to make sure that I keep this joint here square. I want to make sure that I fit this so that this section here is nice and flat and also square to the side where I'm going to be mortising in the front stretcher. It looks pretty good. Alright, one down, 3 more to go. Alright, so it's getting a little tight in here, but like I said, I want to show you some ways that we can work and build this bench without already having a bench. So as you can see, I've got my lumber stacked on my main workbench. I'm not using that workbench at all. And what I've done is I've set up an area here so that I can plane the pieces that I need to plane. So I've ripped this piece from one of the 2x12s. I'm going to use it for the front stretcher, or actually this is the back stretcher on the bottom. And I want to plane this. I want to get this edge square to this face so that I can use it to reference joinery. Well, this is a 6-foot long board. This isn't something that you're just going to, prop up anywhere and plane. So how do you do it? Well, let me grab the camera and I'll take you in on a close-up of how I've got this set up. So I'll ask that you forgive the slight shakiness of the camera. I've also got a light clamped to the top of the camera so that we can see a little bit better. So what I've got here are 2 of the boards that I'm going to use for aprons and tops. So these are just 2x12s here, as you can see, that are sitting on top of some commercial sawhorses. And if you don't have the commercial sawhorses, you can build these out of wood. I just happen to have these sitting in my garage from a previous construction project, so that's what I'm using. And these are 8-foot 2x12s that are sitting on top of the sawhorses, and that's really all you need. Now, what I've done to keep this from moving, hopefully you can see here, I've got an F-clamp clamping a piece of cutoff from the legs. This is just a scrap piece of 4x with a 3/4 inch piece of pine. This is clamped underneath so that it butts up against this sawhorse. the piece of pine on top is clamped across both pieces, as is the 4x4, so that runs underneath, clamped on both sides, so that the 4x4 resists the forward motion and keeps these boards from sliding off the sawhorses. And this 3/4 inch board here serves as your planing stop, and then you can go ahead and plane your boards on top of the 2x12s on top of the sawhorses. Sometimes you might get a little bit of wobble, a little bit of shaking. You can solve that problem by adding some weight to the shelves of the sawhorses. Throw some cinder blocks down there, bags of cement or sand, whatever you've got laying around, that'll add weight to the sawhorses, and that will help with that problem a little bit. I'm probably getting the shaking because my iron in my plane needs to be sharpened. Again, it's not an ideal long-term solution, but for building the bench, works just fine. Now, if you're building, say, a laminated top style, you can do the same type of thing. Use the sawhorses to glue up the sections of your top. Build your top first. Set your top on top of your sawhorses, and then use that as your makeshift workbench to build your base. Since I'm using just two wide boards for my top's already made. Now, important thing to keep in mind, especially with these long stretchers, is that they really don't need to be square the whole length. Really, what's most important is the area where we're going to be cutting the joinery. So the two ends are going to be the most important areas to be square. And in fact, for this particular stretcher, this edge and this face are going to be my references. This side doesn't even need to be planed. I did it anyway just because I prefer it that way, but you could leave this rough sawn right from the rip saw and not even have to worry about touching it. What's important are your reference faces where you're going to mark your joinery off of. So I'm going to be using these two faces here. And again, what's most important is that they be square down towards the ends where I'm going to be cutting that joinery. So once I have the tenons all cut and fit to the mortises, then it's time to draw bore these joints. And I talked about this in the Porringer T-table video, but basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be pegging these joints with some oak pegs, and we're going to bore a slightly offset hole in the tenon so that when we drive the peg, it pulls everything tightly together and we don't need clamps. So for this project, I'm going to be using a size 6 or 3/8 inch bit for a corresponding 3/8 inch peg. So once we have the holes bored in the legs, I put the tenons into the mortises, and I just use the bit to mark the location of the holes on the tenons. So once I have the holes marked, I'm actually going to offset them slightly towards the shoulder. So you can see here, this was the original hole that was marked with the auger bit. And what I've done is offset that hole maybe, 32nd to a 16th of an inch toward the shoulder. And what this does is, by boring the hole here, offset, what happens is when we drive that peg through the leg and the tenon, it's going to draw the joint up tight and we won't need to use any clamps. So when we do our boring in the tenon, we're going to bore here. With all the draw bore holes bored, it's time for some assembly. Maestro, some assembly music, please.
While the glue on the side assemblies dries, I clamp all 4 of my 2x12s together to start planing up the aprons, and I'm planing the inside faces here flat so that I can attach them to the side assemblies. So I start with the 4-plane and I work my way up with the tri-plane until I get them generally flat, and you can see the pencil lines that are scribed across that I'm using to gauge my progress. And then I take the 2 hand screw clamps and 2 F clamps as well to make a makeshift face vise so that I can plane the edge that will go down in that apron. With the aprons done, we can assemble the long stretchers. And as you can see, it helps to have a few extra pair of hands here. Set the assembly upright, put the second stretcher in. Once again, an extra pair of hands always helps. Here I'm nailing and gluing a 1x8 to the inside of the apron, and this is going to prevent the bench from racking, sort of like a dado would, and it's also going to provide a place for me to support the cross-bearing boards that I'll put in later. Then we pre-drilled holes for the cut nails that I used to attach the aprons to the leg assemblies. Before adding any more support boards, I'm making sure that the frame is flat and square using winding sticks. This is going to make for much easier truing of the top later. Then I'm going to use some finish nails and attach the support boards that are going to support the top and provide stiffness to the bench. And you can see here where those 1x's support those boards. Then I take my jack plane and my 4-plane and I plane those supporting boards flush with the rest of the lower bench assembly.
Alright, so about one long weekend, 3 days worth of work, a few hours, probably six hours or so each day, and maybe and just this evening, one evening, and I'm pretty much, I mean, the bench is almost done. It just really needs a top. I need to put the shelf on the bottom, and the final details, the hold-fast holes in the apron, bore the holes in the top for the hold-fast, and just some final finishing touches. But all in all, it's gone together really well and really fast. So I'm pretty impressed with this design so far, and I'm really liking the new height, having it be much lower than, probably a good 4 inches lower than my old bench. So the next time, really, I should be finishing this up. I'll work on the top, mounting the top to the undercarriage, and installing the shelf underneath, putting in, boring the hold-fast holes, no dogs, boring the hold-fast holes in the apron. Planing stop has to be done yet. The hook or the crochet on the front, and the twin screw vise that's going to go down this end. So not really that much more to do. I think another solid weekend to work and this will probably be done. Next episode, really probably be finishing this up.